everyone, welcome to my channel. In today's video, I am super excited to share with all of you my first impressions of the brand new NATASHA DENONA Pastel palette. So I was super excited for the release of this adorable palette over here. This is actually the first new eyeshadow palette that I've picked up this year, which is saying quite a lot because I love eyeshadow palettes. It's my favorite thing to review. But up until now this year, I haven't been that excited with the new releases. But the moment I saw this guy over here, I knew that I had to have it. If you guys have been watching my channel for a while, you know how much I love colorful pastel eyeshadows. And so in today's video, I'll be swatching all of these shades, doing a couple demos, and also giving you guys comparison swatches with my existing pastel eyeshadow collection. And so if you're interested in learning more about this palette, then just stick around. So as always, let's start out with packaging. So it comes in this pastel box, which matches the palette itself. On the back, we have the ingredients and also the shade names and formulas. The palette comes in the same format as NATASHA DENONA's other MIDI palettes, so it's this hard matte plastic. There are holes in the back so you can pop out the shadows and rearrange them as you please. Inside, we have a large mirror and 15 beautiful pastel matte and shimmer shades. And pastels are pretty tricky to formulate, and so I'm really interested in seeing how these guys perform. Usually the problem with pastel eyeshadows is it's really hard for them to stand out against your skin without some sort of white base underneath, and so I'm really curious to see how these guys fare. But first, let's do some swatches. So normally I just swatched the eyeshadows left to right, top to bottom, but for today's video, I'm gonna actually group these shadows by their color, and so that way you guys can more easily compare the shades. There are some shadows in this palette that I do think look somewhat similar, like these two over here, or these two over here, or these over here. And so I think it'll be just helpful to put them side by side so we can really see the differences. So the first shade I'm going to swatch is Bellini. This is in NATASHA DENONA's Creamy Matte formula. So it's more of her standard powdery formula. One thing I am noticing just based on this initial swatch is that there is a decent amount of kick up in the pan when you swatch. So you guys might be able to see that a little bit there. So that just means you have to be a little bit careful with your swatching so you don't get eyeshadow all over the place. I had the same issue with the Trio Chrome palette, if you guys watched my video on that. After swatching, the palette just looked kind of dirty because there was kick up everywhere, but it doesn't affect the performance of the shadows. It's just an issue if you're swatching. So next, let's go into Limoncello. So this was originally in her Tropic palette, so this is a re-release. This is a metallic formulation, but as you can see, it's a relatively subtle sheen, more like a satin metallic, I would say. And actually, let me zoom you guys out a little bit just so you can see a little bit more clearly. I will zoom in again at the very end. So next, let's go into this green family. So we have this shade Zest over here. This is in her cream to powder formula, so slightly more creamy texture. And that actually has pretty good opacity with just a couple swipes. Usually with this sort of shade, it's a little bit hard to get it to show up on your lids, but so far that's pretty promising. It almost has a neon yellow, neon green element to it. Next, let's go into Brisk. This is a creamy matte, so again, her more standard formula, and as you can maybe see, there's a decent amount of fallout there. I just got a lot of shadow that fell onto my dress. Again, I find that's pretty standard with this particular formulation of pastel from NATASHA DENONA. Not a big deal on the eyes, but a little bit messy for the swatches. As you can see though, this is really impressively pigmented for a pastel. That was just one swipe, and I feel like you can really see the color pop against my skin. So I am very excited for this shade over here. Next, let's go into these two shimmery shades. So we have Adriatic and Mint Frost. Mint Frost is also in Tropic. So Adriatic is a metallic shade, and similar to Limoncello, you can see it's not really one of her high shine metallic formulas, much more of just a smooth, shimmery metallic. Whereas Mint Frost is really sparkly. In fact, this is in what she calls her sparkling metallic formula. So there's more chunks of shimmer in there. It's not just totally smooth like Adriatic. And here you can see that difference in the finger swatches. So next let's go into Bubble. This is in her cream to powder formula. So as you can see, the cream to powder just has no fallout, which is the advantage of that formula. This is a really pretty cornflower blue shade. I actually have two matte pastel singles from Terra Moons that look very similar to these two, so I'm looking forward to doing those comparison swatches later. So now let's move from blue to purple. So let's go in with Bora Bora. This is also in her cream to powder formula. Ooh, that's a really pretty shade. And again, I'm very impressed with all of these swatches so far. I was expecting this to be a lot patchier, maybe a lot lighter. I thought I would have to really build them up, but as you guys can see, even just one swipe of these actually leaves pretty good pigmentation. So that's a really pretty lilac tone. Then we have Duet and Dainty. So these two look very similar in pan. Duet is a dual chrome and Dainty is a DCS, so dual chrome sparkling maybe. As you can see, they look quite similar in the camera, but I would say Duet has more of a dual chrome shift to it. You can pretty clearly see a bit of blue in that. Dainty is a little bit less of a shift. It's a shift from this lilac shade into gold instead of to blue. But Dainty definitely has a lot more sparkle to it. So I guess that's where the sparkling comes in. And nice, I think the camera is picking up on that. So you can see they have an overall similar base pigment, but a flip to blue versus a flip to gold. And now let's go into these pink mattes. So we have Feather. This is in her classic creamy matte formula. This one maybe doesn't stand out as much against the skin compared to the others. Really pretty light purpley pink. Then we have Tulle, and this one is in her cream to powder formula. This is sort of your classic bright cool toned pink. And now let's go into Starlit, the center shade. This is also a dual chrome, so it goes from red to gold. Very pretty. This one is actually pretty sparkly as well. She didn't label it as a sparkling shade, but I would say compared to Duet, for example, it does feel like Starlit has a bit more shine going on. And then the final shade over here is Illusion. Ooh, whoa, this is very interesting texture. I've never felt a texture like this from Natasha Denona. It almost feels like plastic. It doesn't really feel like a powder. As you can see, it's kind of a clear opalescent shade that shifts slightly to pink. Also a tiny bit of gold in there as well. Very interesting. So let's put that over here. It's not really a topper because it doesn't really have shine to it. It's more like it has a sheen to it. Interesting. So yeah, I'm curious if you layer this on top of these, whether it'll make them a dual chrome or whether you really need to put this by itself. But here we have all of the shades in the palette, and here it is zoomed in. So overall you can see that roughly half of the palette is in the pinky purple range, and then you have a significant blue teal range, and then you just have a few up here in more of that orangey yellow chartreuse category. So let me know what you guys think about doing the swatches by color like I did today. As I mentioned, that's quite different from how I typically do swatches, but I thought this might be helpful just because we do have so many of these shades that kind of look similar. But as you can see here, they do all have either a different finish or a different flip or a slightly different tone to them. So with the swatches out of the way, let's get these shadows on my lids. So typically for my first impressions, I'm not trying to do the most beautiful looks in the world. I really just want to put as many of these shades on my lids as possible just so you guys can see how they look. So when I first saw this palette, I was most excited for these mint shades over here and this green shade over here. I feel like those are the shades I don't have a lot of in my collection right now, and especially these minty shades are just so perfect for the springtime. So for the first look, I'm going to focus in on those, but also try to bring in some of the other colors. So let's start out with Zest, and I'm going to go in with my worker brush from Sonia G. And this is on an unprimed eyelid, so I just have concealer on. I do think typically with pastels it's better to use primer, so I might put primer on this side. But I first just wanted to see how it looks without primer, because most days I prefer to just keep it simple and apply eyeshadow straight on the lid. So there we go, that's just one layer of the shadow. It is a little bit light, I would say, on initial application, so let me try to build that up a little bit more. This one is in her cream to powder formulation, so that formulation tends to build up more gradually. You usually need to apply sort of light layers and keep going at it. And that's what I'm seeing so far here. But overall, it is building up, which is great. Essentially, the thing I always worry about with pastels is you might not really be able to see them or they blend away, but so far so good with that one. And then flipping over my brush, I'm gonna use the other side to pick up some of Bellini, and this is in a different formulation. So this is in her creamy matte formulation, which is applying much more pigmented, I would say. But of course, the creamy matte does have a little bit more fallout for her pastels. So that's kind of the trade-off there formulation-wise. But that's really pretty. So you can see that built up very easily with just a couple swipes. Ooh, very fun. I'm really digging these two next to each other. It's just so pretty for spring. It's kind of like a peach with a little bit of leaf as well next to it. Using a smaller Wayne Goss number 19 brush, I'm going to go into Brisk because I'm also quite excited about this shade. And I'm going to run this on my lower lash line and kind of bring it close to Zest just so you guys can really see that color difference. So these are quite different shades ultimately. And I would say Brisk is definitely taking a little bit more building up than Zest. This definitely has a little bit more of a white base to it, which is good because I think with this sort of shade it's a little bit hard to see if you don't have a white base. Well, this is definitely going to be quite a tropical look. So now I want to go in with Adriatic and Mint Frost. So I'm going to first take some of Adriatic, since this is the less shimmery, more just typical metallic shade. And I'm going to put this on top of Zest in the outer corner. Okay, interesting. So I feel like this takes a little bit of layering, but it's looking really pretty. Nice shine to that. I feel like Adriatic is coming across a lot lighter on the lids than it comes across in pan. In pan it looks like a pretty deep shade, but I feel like on the lids, once the light hits it, it almost has sort of a frosty look to it. Not really the typical Natasha Denona metallic, a little bit more like a almost 90s frosted look. Speaking of frost, let's go in now with Mint Frost. And this is definitely a little bit more creamy to touch. And I'm going to put this on the inner half of the lid. So you can see that definitely has a lot more shine than Adriatic does. Very pretty shade. Again, if you already have Tropic, then you have this shade already, but I do not have the Tropic palette, so I am very excited to have this in my collection. All right, I do feel like these shimmers didn't layer quite as easily as some of Natasha's other shimmers. It could just be that on top of the pastels, there's not as much grip because the pastels are pretty dry mattes. So I do think on this eye, I'm gonna put down some primer just to make it a little bit easier. So now let me just go back into Bellini and add that back in on this inner portion. Really want that contrast there. And then again, taking some of Zest for this outer corner area. Then on the lower lash line, I'm going to take some of Duet. This is the one that flips to blue. And I'm going to sweep this on the inner portion. Do you feel like you need to dig a little bit into this shade to get it to pick up? As you can see, there's a definite blue shift to it once applied to the lids. And now to finish off this first extremely colorful eye, let's go into Illusion. I have here my rougher number 26 brush, and I'm going to put this in the inner corner. Ooh, okay, so you can definitely see that pinky flip there. Very pretty. Reminds me a lot of Iridescent Pink 005 in Divine Rose 1. We'll have to do that comparison later. So here we have the first eye down. So yes, very colorful, not the standard look I would typically do, but I'm filming this in the evening. I'm not going anywhere after this. And so I wanted to just showcase as many of those shades as possible. And then on this eye now, I'm going to try to use as many of the remaining shades as I can. So let's do sort of a bluish pink look, I guess, on this side. So I'm going to start out with Feather, since this is one of the lightest shades. And I'm going to put this all over the crease area. And I just realized I said I was going to put primer on this side, but I did not. Very sorry about that. But if you guys are interested in more looks, definitely let me know, and I can always film some more tutorials with this palette. But I'll also keep you guys updated on my monthly favorites in terms of how this performs with primer. But that shade went on really well. That's a really, really pretty shade. I really enjoy this sort of lilac pink moment that we have here. And in general, I'll say that if you're someone who doesn't like extremely colorful looks like this, the best way to use this palette is probably just going in with one matte like this and then a corresponding shimmer. So for a more natural look, I would just go in with Dainty on top of this and just call it a day. I think on most days, that's how I would use this palette rather than doing what I did on this side. But today's video is a little bit of an exception. So with Feather down, let's go into Tulle to see if we can add a bit more depth and dimension. And actually, now that I'm applying it, I'm realizing Tulle is actually pretty bright on the eyes. I don't know if you guys can tell. I guess I should have known that from these swatches, but as you can see here, Tulle is not actually very deep. So this is something to note with Natasha Denona's cream to powder formulas. They come across on the lids way lighter than they do in pan. So kind of rethinking how I should do this. I probably should not have put this in the outer portion, but that's okay. We're just playing around today. So I'll just keep building that up a little bit just so you guys can see that shade, but it's a really pretty kind of bubblegum pink shade. Okay, so cleaning off that brush a little bit, I'm going to go into Bora, and this is probably the one I should have put on the outer portion, but it's okay. We'll put it in the inner portion today, just so we can have some separation. So there's Bora, and this one's definitely a lot deeper than some of the other shades, but as you can tell, in general, you're not going to get a ton of depth from this palette. Bora is definitely the deepest shade, and this is basically as deep as it gets. But that's okay. It's a pastel palette, so the purpose is really to have that kind of light, airy, cute look. Very pretty shades. These are definitely the sorts of colors I feel very comfortable with. So now I'm going to go into Starlit with a finger, and I'm going to put this on the outer portion of this lid. Ooh, that is a pretty shade. You can definitely see some of those gold sparkles in there as well, which is nice. I wouldn't say I see like a very prominent shift or anything, but you can definitely see that there's some gold. And then with another finger, I'm going to go into Dainty, and I'm going to press this on the inner half. Ooh, that's nice. Dainty is probably the highest shine shade in this palette. So if you really want something that's just very pretty and glittery, going in with Dainty all over a matte shade is a nice way to go. And with a Refer number 14 brush, I'm going to add some more of Bora back in, and also a bit of Tulle on the outer portion. And now with a Refer number 13, I'm going to go into Bubble, and then sweep that all over the lower lash line, kind of mimicking what we did with Airy on the other side. And this one's building up pretty well. This is also one of the comparatively deeper shades in this palette, which is not saying a lot, but comparatively speaking. I'm also going to flick this upward a little bit just to kind of match a little bit what we have going on that side. And then with the Smudger 1, I'm going to go in with some Limoncello and sweep this in that inner portion of the lower lash line. This is a very pretty shade. Similar to Duet, it does take a little bit of layering, but once it's there, it looks quite nice. And then once again, I'm going to go in with some Illusion on this inner corner. And why not? Let's also just put some Illusion on the brow bone as well. All right, there we go. So I have all of the shades in this palette on my lids. I know this is not the look you guys will probably want to recreate at home, but I just wanted to put all of the shadows on my lids, and so far I am really enjoying how they perform. So I'm going to go off now and finish off this look with some eyeliner and be back with some comparison swatches and my overall initial thoughts about this palette. So here we have the final look. What do you guys think? As always, I'll link in the description box the rest of the products on my face in case you're curious. So on this side, we have kind of the tropical rainforest look with a lot of different minty shades and also that Bellini. And then here we have the predominantly pink and purple look with a little hint of blue. I'd be curious to hear in the comments which of these two looks you guys like better. So now let's go into some comparisons. So the moment this palette came out, I think a lot of folks were comparing this to Circo Loco and also to Trio Chrome. So let me just hold those side by side for you guys. So definitely, even just from the outside packaging, there is a similar vibe between Pastel and Circo Loco. Looking at them side by side, there's a lot of similarities in the overall color story. So Circo Loco also has a lot of teal and pink and purple, but I would say you can tell a huge difference in the saturation. So Circo Loco is an extremely saturated, more jewel tone palette, whereas Pastel is much lighter in tone. And here we have Pastel next to Trio Chrome. So Trio Chrome also has a lot of greens and purples in it, but the overall color story is a lot grungier when it comes to Trio Chrome. It's more like the shadows are a bit desaturated, whereas for Pastel, it's more like they've been mixed with white. So now let's go into some more specific shade comparisons. So let's start out with Tulle and with Feather, since these are the two pinky mattes. So here's Tulle and here's Feather. And starting with Circo Loco, first off, I thought of Cotton Candy as a possible dupe. So it looks like Cotton Candy is a little bit more warm toned in comparison to either of these. Feather is a lot more purpley in comparison to Cotton Candy. And then we also have Joker in Circo Loco. And wow, okay, Joker is totally different. You can see it is extremely saturated, extremely fuchsia. Now going into Trio Chrome, we have Naga. So this is fairly similar, I would say, to Feather. So yeah, these two look pretty similar on the skin. So if you have Trio Chrome, you can probably dupe it with Naga. Next up, let's go in with Illusion. And there's definitely nothing from Natasha Denona that's really similar to Illusion. So instead, let me go into my Pat McGrath Mothership Divine Rose and let's see how Iridescent Pink compares. So here we have that Iridescent Pink 005 shade, and let's see how these look side by side. Yeah, they look very, very similar. So I would say that Illusion maybe just has a tiny bit more warmth, a little bit of gold to it, whereas the Divine Rose shade is much more pink, but Honestly, they are very, very similar. So if you do have Divine Rose, I feel like you can basically dupe Illusion. Next, let's go in with Mint Frost, and the most similar shade to this that I have currently is Snow Cone in Circo Loco. So let's put that next to it. Okay, yeah, Snow Cone I would say is a little bit more bluish in undertone, whereas Mint Frost, as its name implies, is a lot more minty, but they are somewhat similar, and they're both in the sparkling metallic formula. I will say though, swatching Snow Cone, I feel like Snow Cone is a little bit smoother and creamier in comparison to Mint Frost. In general, with the pastel palette, I do feel that the shimmers are a little bit less creamy and adhere a little bit less to the lids in comparison to her previous shimmers. I first noticed that when I was applying the shimmers to my lids, but now that I'm doing swatches, I can really feel the difference. So yeah, I'm not sure what's going on there. It could just be that the pastel formulations are a little bit harder to formulate, or it might be a difference between her larger palettes and smaller palettes. So next up, let's go into Bora, and I think this one is overall pretty unique, but I wanted to compare it with this shade over here in the Mini Love Story. So I think this is R, maybe? Let's try this out. All right, so kind of similar. I would say that the pastel one definitely has more vibrancy to it. The shade from the Mini Love Story is almost a little bit more grungy in undertone. Let's also swatch Tungsten from Trio Chrome. Okay, yeah, similarly a little bit more gray in undertone. And then just for the heck of it, I'm also gonna swatch Manganese, but this one is probably a lot deeper. Yeah. Okay, so Manganese basically looks like a deeper version of Bora. So not an exact dupe for Bora in my collection. All right, so this arm is basically done. So I'm gonna flip things over and go in with Dainty. And I honestly don't think I have a dupe for Dainty in my collection. Wow, look at that shift. Okay, this is definitely probably the best dual chrome from NATASHA Denona. Usually her dual chromes and even her trio chromes are not that good, but look at that shift, so shiny and beautiful. So I'll just swatch a few shades that are kind of similar. So we have Color Flip from Trio Chrome, so much grungier, much more fuchsia, and the flip is to green, so totally different. Then we have You from the Mini Love Story, and this is much more of a bronzy shade. Yeah, definitely very different. So I also just pulled out Retro, since Psychedelic and Glitz might be somewhat similar even though they're not exactly dual chromes. So let's see how those compare. Alrighty, so I would say definitely the closest match is one of these over here. So if you're trying to dupe Dainty, I would say that if you have the Retro palette, going in either with Psychedelic or Glitz is a pretty good way to go. Dainty almost looks like a fusion between these two because it has the sparkle of Psychedelic but the flip of Glitz. Moving right along, let's go in with these three mattes from Pastel. They're all kind of in a similar color family. So let's see how these compare to other shades in my collection. So we have Brisk on top, Airy in the middle, and then Bubble on the bottom. And Airy is having a little bit of a hard time sticking to my arm, but that's okay. So first from Circo Loco, let's go in with Fun to Mime. And okay, Fun to Mime is very similar to Brisk and Airy. I think it kind of looks like a hybrid between the two of them. Now going into my indie eyeshadow collection, I have these two shades from Terra Moons. So we have Daydreamer, which is the blue one, and Lunar or Later, which is more of the minty one. So let's swatch these two guys over here. So here is Lunar or Later. Very, very flaky shade, and Daydreamer. Alrighty, yeah, I would say these two are extremely similar to these two over here. So if you want to dupe this palette, Terra Moons does have some pretty good pastel mattes that might be worth looking into. So moving right along, let's go into Adriatic from Pastel. And this looks a lot to me like Flip from Circo Loco. So let's see. Okay, Flip is a lot deeper than Adriatic. Let me actually also just do Snow Cone again. Okay, and Snow Cone is just a little bit more blue. So Adriatic is pretty unique in comparison. Next, we have Starlit. So this one doesn't strike me as super unique overall because it's basically a red shade with some gold shimmer. But let's see if I have anything quite like this. So we have a couple possibilities from bronze. We have Bliss over here and High Degree. So here is High Degree. Okay, a lot more bronzy and brown in undertone. And here's Bliss. Okay, so it does look pretty similar to Bliss. Let me build that up a little bit. Bliss has more of a shift to it and is a little bit more orangey, but overall their base pigment is quite similar and they both have that gold. All right, turning my arm around again, let's go in with Bellini. This looks very similar to a lot of blushes, so if you have any sort of peachy, orangey blushes, you can probably also dupe it that way. So this reminds me of Plutonium in Trio Chrome. All right, never mind. Plutonium is a lot more grungy and deep. Let's try Diatonic from Trio Chrome. All right, yeah, it's pretty similar to Diatonic, I would say. And another comparison I thought of was with this shade, which is called Lotus Paradise from the Pat McGrath Fleur Fantasia quad. So let's watch that. Okay, yeah, a little bit more peachy in undertone in comparison to Bellini, but overall kind of similar. On the whole, Bellini is just a lot lighter than these other shades that I have. So next up, let's go into Limoncello from the Pastel palette. This shade is pretty unique in terms of its formulation and finish. So going back into Divine Rose 1, we have this pale yellow shade over here. Okay, that one is way more gold in undertone. I also have here Subliminal from Pat McGrath, and there's another pale yellow shade. So let's see how that compares. Okay, much more similar, but still the Pat McGrath is way more shiny and gold in comparison to the Natasha Denona. And then going back into Fleur Fantasia, we have Utopia over here. This is more of a similar finish, but yeah, very different shade. It doesn't really have that white base that the Limoncello shade does. All right, so I guess Limoncello is actually pretty unique even though it just looks like a gold shade. So now let's go into Duet. This one I think is also quite unique, but let's go in with this lavender blue shade from Pat McGrath's Fleur Fantasia. I think this is probably the most similar I have. Okay, yeah, actually lavender blue is a very good dupe for Duet. I would say Duet is maybe a tiny bit shinier and lavender blue is maybe a tiny bit more blue in its shift. But yeah, if you have Fleur Fantasia, there's definitely a lot of similar vibes going on between this and Pastel. So now we have the final shade, which is Zest. I already went over Airy and Feather separately, so I don't think I have a whole lot to compare with Zest. Let's go into Trio Chrome, which probably has the most similar shades, and I'm going to swatch Ion and Vert. So here is Ion, much more yellowy and darker green, and here is Vert, way grungier. This one's also probably a stretch, but I'm going to go into Lethal from my Metropolis palette. Yeah, that's going to be a lot deeper as well, but just in case any of you were curious, yeah, very, very different. Alrighty, so that was all of the comparison swatches. Hopefully that was helpful for any of you who might have some of these other palettes and might be debating about whether to pick up Pastel. So now let's get into my overall initial impressions about this palette. So on the whole, I am quite pleased with this palette. It is just so cute, and I can just think of all sorts of fun, colorful looks to do. Based on the comparison swatches, I will say that I do have dupes for most of these shades in my collection. But that said, I did have to open up a lot of palettes in order to find those dupes, so it is nice to have everything in one place. In general, this palette really screams spring to me, so I'm really excited to play around with this in the coming months. I think this palette is especially good if you're someone who passed on Triochrome and Circo Loco. I have both of those and I love those so much, but they are extremely expensive. For me, I got those two palettes on sale, and so it was worth it to me, but even at that, they were still pretty steep. So I think this one at $65 is a really good deal because you get a decent selection of colorful shades, which if you're someone who doesn't normally dabble in color, is probably more than enough to satisfy your needs. In terms of the formulation in this palette, overall I felt like the mattes performed very well. Pastel mattes are some of the hardest mattes to formulate in that you really need the shade to have a bit of a white base on it so that it can stand out on your skin regardless of your skin tone. If you do have a deeper skin tone than me and you've tried out this palette, I would be really curious to hear how you found it. On my skin tone, all of the shades for the most part stood out pretty well. I would say Feather and Tulle did take a decent amount of building up, but the rest of them really held their own pretty well. Similar to Circo Loco and Triochrome, if you go into the creamy matte shades, so that's just the normal powder formula she has, there is a decent amount of kick up in the pan, and if you swatch it, the shade does kind of break up a little bit. So that is one thing to be careful of. The cream to powder formula in this palette is much less messy to work with, but does take more building up to get opacity. Overall though, I'm very pleased with all of the mattes in this palette. I would say the shimmers for me were a little bit more of a mixed bag. I think Illusion is a very unique formula for Natasha Denona. I haven't felt this sort of almost plasticky feeling shade before. And when I say plasticky, I don't mean in a bad way, but it doesn't feel like a powder. It sort of feels like there's almost like a layer of film there. But that shade performs really well. I would say for the other shimmers, they do take a little bit of building up. They're not as creamy and emollient as the shimmers in Circo Loco and Triochrome. And so whereas those just apply in a very pigmented layer with just one swipe on the lid, with all of the shimmers in this palette, I did feel like I needed to build them up a little bit. In case you're accustomed to Natasha Denona's typical creamy metallic formula, these are just a little bit drier and less creamy. So on the whole, I really enjoyed my first impression of this palette. I'm really excited to have it in my collection, and I find this color story pretty inspiring overall for me to kind of try out new looks outside of my typical day-to-day. I would love to hear down in the comments what you guys think about this palette. Are any of you picking it up? And if you have, I would love to hear your thoughts about it. So that's it for today's video. If you guys like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel. Thank you all so much for joining me today, and I'll catch you next time. Bye!